who started the legendary New England clambake tradition? Was it really just about cooking dinner, or did it mean something deeper to the people who first dug those pits in the sand? How many centuries have passed since the first wisps of steam rose from seaweed-covered stones? And what would those ancient cooks think if they saw what their simple method has become today? The honest answer is, we'll probably never pinpoint an exact moment or person who invented the clambake. Archaeological evidence points to indigenous peoples along these northeastern shores developing this cooking technique somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 years ago, though pinning down specifics gets murky when you're dealing with cooking pits washed away by countless tides. The remnants archaeologists do find: bits of fire-cracked rock, shell middens, charcoal deposits near ancient shorelines. They paint a picture of coastal communities who understood something profound about cooking with the elements at hand. Our journey through this savory slice of history promises to reveal not just how people cooked clams, but how a practical method became woven into the very fabric of New England's identity. Along the way, you might find yourself drifting into that peaceful state where stories blend with dreams, where the sound of waves and crackling fires carries you gently towards sleep. Subscribe whenever the mood strikes you. No pressure at all, just a gentle invitation for more stories like this one. Share your listening spot in the comments below. Are you tucked in bed, riding a late train, or perhaps stealing a quiet moment at work? I'm always curious where these stories find their listeners. Before we begin, why not adjust your room to the perfect sleeping temperature, somewhere around 65 to 68 degrees if you can manage it, and let your shoulders sink a little deeper into whatever's supporting you right now. You're standing on a New England beach, but not the one from summer postcards. This beach exists somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, long before the first European sail appeared on the horizon. The evidence for what happens here comes from archaeological digs scattered across the region, shell deposits, and fire-cracked rocks that tell stories without words. The people who inhabit this coastline, they belong to various groups archaeologists associate with the late Archaic and Woodland periods. These aren't the names they called themselves, of course. Those names are lost to time. What remains are traces of their ingenuity, evidence suggesting they discovered something remarkable about combining fire, stones, water, and the sea's bounty. You watch them dig into the sand, though watch might be too strong a word since we're reconstructing the scene from scattered clues. The pit they're creating is roughly 3 feet across, maybe 4. Some sites show smaller family-sized depressions. Others suggest massive communal areas that could have fed entire villages. The stones they gather aren't just any beach rocks. Archaeological analysis shows they selected specific types, usually igneous rocks like granite or basalt that could withstand extreme heat without exploding. Honestly, I can't imagine being the person who discovered the hard way that limestone explodes when heated. That must have been quite the dinner party surprise. The wrong type of rock, heated and then doused with water, could shatter violently. Modern archaeologists have found these fire-cracked rocks scattered across hundreds of coastal sites from Maine to Connecticut, each one a piece of evidence in a massive culinary puzzle. The patterns of these stones, their mineral composition, the carbon deposits on their surfaces, they all whisper stories about ancient cooking methods. Charcoal analysis from various sites suggests they used specific hardwoods: oak, hickory, maple, woods that burn hot and long. They let the fire burn down until stones glowed with stored heat, a process that probably took hours. This wasn't fast food by any stretch. It was an investment of time, suggesting these meals meant something beyond simple sustenance. Now comes the part that makes archaeologists scratch their heads: the seaweed. It doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record, decomposing quickly, leaving barely a trace. But researchers have found microscopic remains, tiny fragments of marine algae preserved in soil layers. The particular species identified, mainly rockweed or Fucus vesiculosus, contains small air bladders that pop when heated, releasing bursts of steam. Nature's own pressure cooker, really. Those little pops must have sounded like underwater popcorn. What really intrigues researchers is the social aspect these cooking sites imply. Many are too large for single-family meals. The sheer volume of shells in some middens, deposits built up over centuries, suggests these were gathering places. Some archaeologists theorize these communal meals served important social functions, cementing alliances, marking seasonal transitions. Others argue the size might simply reflect practical efficiency. Why heat stones for a small meal when the same effort could feed the whole village? Shell growth patterns tell us what season animals were harvested, like reading tree rings, but in miniature. Many sites show peak activity from late spring through early fall, when shellfish are safest to eat and most abundant. Winter clambakes probably weren't much of a thing. Shellfish can be toxic during certain months, something these ancient peoples clearly understood. Regional variations in the archaeological record suggest this wasn't a technique spreading from one source, but rather something developing independently across multiple coastal communities. It's oddly comforting to think that humans everywhere look at hot rocks and steamy seaweed and think, I bet I could cook with that. Whether this represents parallel innovation or gradual cultural exchange, well, that debate continues simmering in academic circles. Modern experimental archaeologists have recreated these ancient clambakes using only prehistoric tools and materials. Their findings are illuminating. It takes about 4 hours from start to finish, but one properly constructed pit can feed 20 or 30 people. The temperature inside reaches about 200 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for gentle steaming without overcooking. The social implications keep returning to researchers studying these sites. This wasn't solitary cooking. The effort required demanded cooperation. And the waiting time, those hours while food steamed, that created space for community, for storytelling, for the transmission of cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. As you contemplate these ancient beaches, These long ago gatherings, you're seeing the deep roots of what would eventually become a defining characteristic of New England culture. These nameless cooks, they laid the foundation for a tradition that would survive conquest, colonization, and countless changes. But the specific peoples who would carry this tradition forward, who would refine it and name it and make it their own, they deserve their own careful attention. The specific peoples who perfected this coastal cooking method deserve more than just a footnote in history. They had names, languages, complex societies that thrived along these shores for thousands of years before any European knew this continent existed. The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Pequot, the Penobscot, these are the names we know them by today, though each group had their own way of identifying themselves, names that often simply meant the people in their respective languages. You're moving forward in time now, somewhere around 1000 to 1500 CE, though these dates remain fluid since oral histories don't always translate neatly into Western calendars. The archaeological record from this period shows something fascinating. The cooking pits get more sophisticated, more standardized. The Wampanoag peoples, who inhabited what's now southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, they seem to have developed particularly refined techniques that other groups would later adopt. The word clambake itself wouldn't exist for centuries yet. The Wampanoag called it something closer to apanoag, though linguistic scholars debate the exact pronunciation and meaning. Some translate it as seafood cooking. Others suggest it meant something more like the bringing together. I rather like that second interpretation. Even if it might be romanticized, food has always been about more than just eating, hasn't it? What made the Wampanoag and other Algonquian-speaking peoples' approach distinctive wasn't just the technique, it was the complete system they developed around it. Evidence suggests they had specific roles for different community members. Some gathered wood, others selected stones. The elderly directed the layering based on generations of accumulated knowledge. Children learned by watching and gradually participating, first gathering seaweed, then learning to judge when stones were properly heated. The seasonal calendar these peoples followed was intimately tied to shellfish availability. Soft-shell clams in spring, quahogs in summer, oysters in fall when they were fattest. They knew through careful observation, shellfish harvested during months without an R could make you sick. Modern science would later confirm this wisdom. Red tide and other algal blooms that produce toxins are most common in warmer months. The Narragansett peoples, who lived in what's now Rhode Island, they added their own innovations. Archaeological sites show evidence of ceramic vessels near cooking pits, possibly for making broths from the cooking liquids. They also seem to have been among the first to add corn to their coastal steaming pits. Kernels found carbonized in several sites dating to around 1200 C. The gathering of food itself was often gender-specific work. Women typically harvested shellfish in tidal zones while men fished deeper waters. But the cooking appears to have been communal, based on artifact positioning and cooking area sizes. The Pequot peoples of Connecticut developed their own variations, combining freshwater and saltwater species in their pits. Eel bones appear frequently alongside clam shells. Honestly, after trying eel once at a sushi restaurant, I can understand why they'd want to steam it with lots of other flavors involved. What's particularly interesting is how these cooking events aligned with social and spiritual practices. Many indigenous peoples held Thanksgiving ceremonies throughout the year. The green corn ceremony, the strawberry Thanksgiving, and gatherings celebrating the ocean's abundance. These weren't just meals, they were expressions of reciprocity with the natural world. The Penobscot further north and Maine faced different challenges. Rockier coasts and colder waters meant different species. They relied heavily on lobster, which was so abundant that it could be gathered by hand at low tide. They also incorporated more aromatic plants, wintergreen, sweet fern, wild herbs that grew near the shore. Here's where scholarly debates get interesting. Some archaeologists argue the Clambake tradition represents one of the earliest forms of aquaculture in North America. Shell middens show consistent harvesting from the same beds over centuries, never to depletion. Size distribution suggests they took mature specimens while leaving younger ones. Whether this was intentional management or practical wisdom, that question keeps academics arguing politely at conferences. The spiritual significance can't be separated from practical purpose. For many indigenous peoples, cooking communally was itself sacred. But transformation through fire and steam was seen as everyday magic. Some groups had specific prayers for different cooking stages, though most oral traditions were disrupted during the colonial period. What survives in historical records, filtered through European observers who didn't always understand what they were seeing, suggests these gatherings could be massive. Samuel de Champlain in 1605 described witnessing several hundred indigenous people engaged in what appears to have been a monumental clambake. His account mentions the abundance of shellfish and efficient cooking methods observed. The tools involved were sophisticated, baskets woven so tightly they could hold water, stone tools shaped for opening shells. Even seaweed selection showed expertise. They knew which varieties produced the most steam, which added best flavor, which might make food bitter if used incorrectly. Their tidal knowledge was encyclopedic. Not just daily patterns, but monthly variations, spring and neap tides, how storms affected shellfish behavior. This wasn't casual foraging, it was systematic harvesting based on deep ecological understanding. Sometimes I can barely remember if it's recycling day, and these folks tracked multiple lunar cycles without written calendars. Different groups had different preferences. The Mashpee Wampanoag favored wild onions and Jerusalem artichokes. The Aquinnah Wampanoag on Martha's Vineyard included specific seaweeds from certain coves. These reflected intimate knowledge of local ecosystems. Trade networks meant inland peoples also participated. Archaeological evidence shows marine shells far inland, suggesting either preserved seafood was traded or seasonal coastal journeys occurred. The clambake served as a nexus for exchange, not just food but news, goods and cultural practices. The sophistication of these traditions would soon encounter something unprecedented: ships carrying strangers from across the ocean, bringing diseases, different worldviews, and an appetite for land that would fundamentally alter these communities. Before that collision, before the traditional Wampanoag would transform into what English speakers would call the Clambake, these cooking traditions had reached refinement that took millennia to achieve. The question of what happened when these two culinary worlds met, well, that's where our story takes a particularly complex turn. The autumn of 1620 brought more than just falling leaves to the New England coast. It brought the Mayflower and its weary passengers to what they would call Plymouth. The Pilgrims, as history remembers them, were about to encounter a way of cooking that would quite literally help them survive. Though the romanticized version of this meeting that appears in children's books bears little resemblance to what historical records actually suggest. You have to understand the state these English settlers were in. Half-starved, completely unprepared for the harsh New England winter, many already sick with scurvy and pneumonia. They'd been living on hardtack and salt pork for months. The indigenous peoples watching from the forests must have found them pitiful. I mean, imagine showing up to someone else's homeland without knowing how to find food there. It's like arriving at a potluck with an empty casserole dish and a lot of confidence. The first documented encounter between colonists and indigenous cooking methods didn't happen at some grand Thanksgiving feast. It happened in desperate, fragmented moments. William Bradford's journal mentions finding indigenous storage pits filled with corn and beans, which the colonists promptly took. They also found evidence of recent cooking fires near the shore, stones still arranged in circles, shells scattered nearby. But here's where we need to separate legend from what records actually tell us. The story goes that Squanto taught the Pilgrims about the clambake along with his famous fish as fertilizer technique. The historical Tisquantum was indeed real, a Patuxet man who'd been enslaved, taken to Europe, learned English, and somehow made it back to find his entire village dead from disease. His story is far more complex and tragic than the simplified version taught in schools. What primary sources actually say about those early encounters with indigenous cooking is frustratingly vague. Edward Winslow wrote about natives bringing such abundance of fish and demonstrating preparation methods, but he doesn't describe techniques in detail. These English writers were more concerned with property lines and religious matters than documenting recipes, though honestly, a cookbook from 1621 Plymouth would be worth its weight in gold today. The colonists' initial reactions to indigenous seafood preparation ranged from curiosity to suspicion. Many came from inland areas where shellfish were considered poverty food. The idea of eating lobster, which they called sea insects, was particularly repellent at first. It's documented that they fed lobster to prisoners and servants so often that some contracts eventually included clauses limiting lobster meals to twice a week. By spring 1621, pure necessity had made colonists more receptive to local food wisdom. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit and his people, for reasons historians still debate, decided to help these struggling newcomers? Was it political strategy? Genuine compassion? A calculation about European weapons as protection? The written records, all from English hands, can't tell us what the Wampanoag were thinking, only what they did. The techniques colonists observed were precise and practiced. The layering of ingredients, the timing, the seaweed selection. But they filtered everything through their own cultural lens. Where Indigenous cooks saw a complete system tied to spiritual practice, the English saw a convenient way to cook large quantities with minimal iron cookware, which was scarce and precious. The colonists were absolutely terrible at this at first. Roger Williams wrote about English attempts that resulted in undercooked shellfish, exploded rocks, and at least one incident where someone used the wrong seaweed and made everyone sick. It's like watching someone try to make sushi after seeing it done once, confidence wildly exceeding confidence. Archaeological evidence from early colonial sites shows this cultural exchange in the soil itself. Cooking pits that start following indigenous patterns precisely, then gradually incorporate European elements. Iron pot fragments mixed with traditional cooking stones. Cattle bones alongside clamshells. The fusion cuisine of the 17th century, preserved in dirt and ash. Written accounts from the 1630s show colonists becoming more comfortable with coastal cooking methods. John Josselin, visiting in 1638, described watching locals, both Indigenous and English, preparing what he called a great feast of shells on the beach. His description includes details about hot stones and seaweed matching traditional Indigenous methods almost exactly, though he adds that some English were beginning to add butter and herbs from their gardens. What's particularly interesting is how gender roles shifted around these practices. In Indigenous communities, shellfish gathering was primarily women's work, but English colonial women were often restricted from beach foraging alone. This created an odd situation where English men were learning cooking techniques from Indigenous women, a cultural exchange that went largely unrecorded but must have been awkward given both societies' gender norms. Disease played a horrible role in this cultural transmission. As Indigenous populations were devastated by European diseases, sometimes losing 90% of their people, their sophisticated knowledge systems were fragmenting. Colonists were learning techniques from communities being simultaneously destroyed. It's bitter irony that many traditional New England practices were preserved by the very people whose arrival caused such devastation. By 1650, something recognizable as a hybrid tradition was emerging. Colonial accounts describe gatherings combining elements of both cultures. Hot stones and seaweed, yes, but also iron pots for melting butter. Indigenous layering techniques, but with European vegetables added. The Algonquian word Wampanoag was giving way to English descriptive phrases. The Indian method of shore cooking gradually shortened to shore bake and eventually clambake. Religious tensions complicated these exchanges. Many Puritan leaders worried that adopting Indigenous practices might lead to spiritual contamination. Cotton Mather wrote warnings about heathen customs, though he seemed to make exceptions for food preparation with practical value. The cognitive dissonance required simultaneously considering Indigenous peoples savages, while depending on their ecological knowledge, shaped colonial attitudes in ways persisting today. Some colonists became genuine students of Indigenous practices. Roger Williams learned Narragansett language and documented their customs with more respect than most contemporaries. His writings preserve details about cooking methods that might otherwise have been lost. He noted ceremonial aspects, prayers offered, the significance of sharing food prepared this way, details purely practical accounts overlooked. As the 1650s drew to a close, the demographic balance was shifting dramatically. English colonists now outnumbered Indigenous peoples in southern New England. The traditional Wampanoag was becoming the colonial Clambake, transformed, appropriated, simplified in some ways, and elaborated in others. The sacred becoming secular, the communal becoming commercial. What had been a carefully maintained Indigenous tradition for millennia was about to become something quite different, something that would eventually be claimed as a defining feature of colonial New England culture. Like the early cooking pits from Section 1, these methods were evolving, but now the evolution was being driven by entirely different forces. The transformation from survival technique to social tradition didn't happen overnight. It evolved slowly through the late 1600s and into the 1700s as colonial settlements grew from desperate footholds into established communities. You're watching now as the Clambake begins its journey from Indigenous sacred practice through colonial pragmatism towards something entirely new, the New England social institution. By the 1680s, second and third generation colonists were growing up with a very different relationship to this land. These young people had never known England, learned to dig clams as children, knew which beaches yielded the best quahogs. Town records from this period start mentioning shore cooking not as exotic native practice, but simply how things were done. The town records of Scituate, Massachusetts from 1689 mention regulations about beach gatherings. Apparently, some families were monopolizing the best spots. Imagine having to legislate who gets which stretch of beach for their clambake. It's like HOA rules, but with actual historical significance. What's fascinating is how Puritan New England's religious framework reshaped these gatherings. Indigenous spiritual elements were stripped away, replaced with Protestant prayers. Yet some communal aspects Puritans valued: shared labor, fellowship, simplicity, aligned well with traditional practices, even if colonists would never admit the parallel. Church records from early 1700s show something unexpected: clambakes for fundraising. The First Congregational Church of Yarmouth has 1713 entries describing a gathering at the shore for provision, where members prepared food to sell, raising money for a new roof. The sacred tradition had become a church fundraiser. Social hierarchies played out interestingly on the beach. Wealthy merchants might sponsor events, providing butter and beer, but still had to wait like everyone else for stones to heat. The clambake had a democratizing effect. You couldn't speed up the process with money or status. By the 1720s, we see competitive clam baking emerging. Letters between Rhode Island and Massachusetts families contain arguments about whose method was superior. Should you add corn? Were potatoes acceptable? Was butter essential? These are basically the same arguments New Englanders have today, except now on Facebook instead of letters. The Great Awakening of 1730s to 1740s brought unexpected boost to the tradition. Revival meetings lasting multiple days needed to feed crowds. The solution? Massive communal clam bakes. Jonathan Edwards reportedly attended several, though his writings focus more on souls than shellfish. These events could feed hundreds, combining spiritual and physical nourishment. Marriage records reveal clam bakes becoming wedding celebrations, particularly for families who couldn't afford indoor feasts. Communities participated not just as guests, but as cooks, tending fires, managing steam. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, brought unexpected changes. Military dispatches mention colonial troops teaching British regulars this: efficient shore provisioning. British officers accustomed to rigid protocols were initially skeptical of food cooked in sand and seaweed. But practicality won. Feeding troops quickly made clam bakes strategically valuable. Women's roles were evolving complexly. While Indigenous women had held shellfish knowledge, colonial women were often relegated to preparing accompaniments, cornbread, preserves. Yet diary entries suggest they quietly maintained actual cooking techniques, even if men claimed public credit for managing fires. Alcohol at clam bakes became a recurring issue in town records. Some communities banned rum after public drunkenness incidents. A 1746 Gloucester petition argued moderate refreshment was necessary for those laboring over hot stones, though moderate was apparently subjective. Seasonal patterns solidified into tradition. Spring clam bakes celebrated surviving winter. Summer marked harvests. Fall prepared communities for harsh months ahead. Each season brought different shellfish, vegetables, meanings. By 1760s, newspapers carried advertisements for public clam bakes. All gentlemen and ladies invited to partake reads one Boston newsletter ad. Admission prices, promises of music, emphasis on genteel company. The tradition was moving from necessity toward entertainment. Benjamin Franklin, visiting in 1763, wrote about attending a clam bake, noting how colonists adopted the Indian method entirely, yet speak of Indians as savage. His observation cuts right to it. We're often blind to our own contradictions. Growing British tensions added political dimensions. By late 1760s, clam bakes became venues for discussing resistance. Beach gatherings were harder to monitor than tavern meetings. Some historians argue revolution plans were literally steamed alongside shellfish. The scholarly debate continues whether this transformation represents cultural exchange or appropriation, though evidence suggests both processes occurred simultaneously, shaped by power dynamics that remain controversial today. As the 1700s entered final decades, what began as indigenous survival technique was thoroughly transformed, now colonial, commercial, political. Yet something essential remained: community gathering, food sharing, patient waiting while steam worked its ancient magic. Like those early pits from our first section evolved through different hands, now tradition was about to take revolutionary significance. The approaching revolution would add new meaning. Independence Day was about to get its signature meal. Independence Day and clambakes. The connection seems so natural now that it's hard to imagine July 4th without them. But you're about to discover how this pairing emerged from the revolutionary fervor of the late 1700s and early 1800s, when a new nation was trying to figure out what it meant to be American, and food became part of that identity. The first documented patriotic clambake appears in Rhode Island records from 1777. Though calling it the first would be misleading since others probably occurred without being recorded. What we know is that patriots in Newport, having just driven out British forces, celebrated with what they called a feast in the Indian manner upon the shore. The symbolism wasn't subtle, rejecting British refined dining for something distinctly of this land. It's almost poetic, really, declaring independence while eating food cooked in a way the British never would. You have to understand the political climate of these gatherings. The revolution wasn't just fought on battlefields, but in everyday choices about how to live, what to eat, how to celebrate. The clambake represented something fundamentally democratic. No fancy china, no servants, everyone waiting equally for the stones to heat. John Adams, writing to Abigail in 1778, described attending a clambake where men of all stations gathered as equals around the steaming pits. The immediate post-war years saw these political clambakes multiply. Veterans groups particularly embraced them. The Society of the Cincinnati held annual clambakes starting in 1784, combining military nostalgia with political networking. These weren't just meals. They were statements about American identity, about rejecting European aristocratic traditions in favor of something uniquely American, even if that American tradition was actually indigenous. By the 1790s, competing political parties were using clambakes as campaign events. Federalists and Democratic Republicans each claimed their clambakes were more authentic, more American. Thomas Jefferson's supporters held Democratic clambakes emphasizing simplicity and equality. Federalists countered with their own events, adding elaborate accompaniments, but keeping the basic cooking method. The irony of political parties arguing about the correct way to appropriate an indigenous tradition, well, it apparently escaped most participants. The War of 1812 intensified the patriotic associations. British blockades made imported food scarce, driving people back to local food sources. Newspapers from 1813 encouraged patriotic consumption of local shellfish. One Boston editorial declared that every clam eaten is a blow against British tyranny, which seems a bit dramatic for dinner, but wartime rhetoric tends toward extremes. You see the tradition evolving differently in different states. Massachusetts clambakes became more formal affairs, with printed invitations and scheduled speakers. Rhode Island maintained a casual approach, emphasizing beach democracy. Connecticut developed its own style, adding locally smoked meats. Each state claimed theirs was most authentically American, though what that meant kept shifting. The Lafayette Tour of 1824 to 1825 brought European attention to American clambakes. The Revolutionary War hero attended several during his farewell tour, and French companions wrote detailed accounts. One described it as democracy made edible. Everyone from governors to laborers eating with their hands from communal piles. Lafayette reportedly said it reminded him of military campaigns, though presumably with better outcomes. Women's roles in patriotic clambakes reveal interesting tensions. While excluded from political participation, women organized many of these events. The Ladies' Auxiliary of various societies managed logistics, supervised preparation, sometimes gave speeches about Republican motherhood while steam rose from the pits. Sarah Josepha Hale wrote in 1828 that clambakes offered women a sphere of patriotic influence, even without the vote. The temperance movement complicated patriotic clambakes in the 1830s. Some argued alcohol had no place in Republican celebrations. Others insisted moderate drinking was itself a democratic right. Imagine people getting into shouting matches about whether rum belongs at a clambake, as if democracy's fate hung in the balance. Towns sometimes held competing wet and dry Independence Day clambakes. Religious overtones crept into these gatherings. Ministers gave invocations comparing the transformation of raw shellfish through steam to America's transformation through revolution. Some sermons got quite elaborate with metaphors, layers of food representing social classes united in democratic heat, waiting periods symbolizing patience for liberty. The rise of formal city celebrations created interesting dynamics. Urban elites held fancy indoor banquets, while working-class people maintained beach clambakes. Newspapers from the 1840s described tensions between official celebrations and popular clambakes. Boston attempted a grand democratic clambake in 1843 that ended in chaos when 10,000 people showed up for food prepared for 2,000. Military traditions became embedded in patriotic clambakes. Cannon fire signaling starts, veterans given first portions, military bands providing music. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, added new elements. Returning soldiers brought spices and techniques, creating fusion clambakes that horrified purists. One Connecticut newspaper complained in 1849 about foreign influences corrupting our national feast. The scholarly discussion about when clambakes became officially associated with Independence Day remains unsettled. Some historians point to the 1820s. Others argue it wasn't universal until after the Civil War. Regional variations complicate any definitive timeline. What's clear is that by 1850, the connection was strong enough that many Americans couldn't imagine July 4th without a clambake. Immigrant communities added their own interpretations. Irish immigrants incorporated potatoes and soda bread. Germans added sausages. Each group claimed they were making the tradition more American by adding contributions. It's beautifully ironic, a Native American cooking method appropriated by British colonists, becoming the symbol of American independence, then modified by each new immigrant wave. The commercialization of patriotic clambakes accelerated in the 1840s. Entrepreneurs offered complete patriotic packages, including food, cooking services, even pre-written speeches. You could literally order democracy by the pound. Advertisements promised authentic American experiences requiring no actual work, just payment. Political violence occasionally erupted at these gatherings. The 1835 Great Clambake Riot in Providence started when Whigs and Democrats claimed the same beach. 20 people were injured in what newspapers called the most undemocratic display at a democratic feast. By the 1850s, the clambake had become so associated with American patriotism that foreign visitors specifically requested to attend them. British visitors appalled at eating without cutlery. French observers puzzled by lack of sauces, Germans confused by casual mixing of social classes. The approach of Civil War added new tensions. Abolitionists held freedom clambakes, while pro-slavery forces organized their own events. The shared tradition was splitting along the same lines as the nation. Some of the last unified patriotic clambakes before war occurred in 1859. Participants later recalled underlying tensions, everyone pretending unity while divisions simmered beneath the surface, much like those layered ingredients in the pits, pressure building toward an inevitable transformation. Soon, the clambake would need to help heal a divided nation, but first it would witness the country tear itself apart. The period from 1850 to 1890 witnessed something extraordinary. The clambake transformed from a regional tradition into a massive commercial spectacle. You're entering the age of steam engines and industrialization, when entrepreneurs looked at the ancient cooking method and saw dollar signs rising with the steam from the seaweed-covered pits. Rhode Island led this commercial revolution, particularly the resort areas around Narragansett Bay. Rocky Point Park, established in 1847, could serve clambakes to 5,000 people simultaneously by the 1850s. The infrastructure they developed was staggering: permanent stone-lined pits, specialized steamers, rail connections to bring visitors from Providence and beyond. What had been a day's work for a community became an hourly business operation. The technology evolved rapidly during this period. Traditional pit cooking couldn't meet commercial demands, so inventors developed portable Clambake steamers, large metal boxes that could be placed over fires. Patent records from the 1860s show dozens of designs for improved clam baking apparatus. Purists were horrified, though honestly, getting upset about cooking technology while ignoring that you're commercializing a sacred indigenous practice seems like missing the larger point. You see the rise of the Clambake Pavilion, massive wooden structures built specifically for these events. The Shore Dinner Hall at Crescent Park in Riverside, Rhode Island, opened in 1886 with seating for 1,200. These weren't just restaurants, they were theaters of consumption, complete with bands, dancing floors, and viewing areas where guests could watch the cooking process through large windows. The Civil War briefly interrupted this commercial expansion, but it roared back stronger afterward. Veterans organizations adopted clambakes for reunions, both Union and Confederate groups ironically using the same indigenous cooking method to commemorate their divisions. The Grand Army of the Republic's 1878 clambake in Massachusetts served 20,000 veterans, the largest single clambake ever attempted at that time. Class dynamics became increasingly complex in these commercial operations. Wealthy families could reserve private clambake grounds with servants to handle the actual cooking. Working-class families attended massive public bakes where thousands ate together. The democratic ideal of the clambake was stratifying. You might be eating the same food, but definitely not in the same company. The railroad companies became major players in the clambake business. They built special clambake lines to beaches, offered package deals including transportation and meals, even created artificial beaches where natural ones didn't exist. The old colony railroad's Clambake Express ran multiple trains daily during summer months. Marketing posters from the 1880s promised a journey to democracy's feast, though first-class and third-class passengers were carefully separated upon arrival. Competition between venues grew fierce. Each claimed to have the original or authentic method. The Rocky Point Shore dinner included clams, fish, sausages, potatoes, onions, brown bread, and watermelon. Crescent Park added lobster and sweet corn. Fields Point introduced the white chowder that would become Rhode Island's signature, distinct from Boston's cream-based version. These additions sparked furious debates about tradition versus innovation. The labor behind these massive operations was largely invisible in promotional materials. Hundreds of workers, many of them recent immigrants, dug pits, gathered seaweed, tended fires, and served food. Irish and Portuguese workers dominated the industry by the 1880s, bringing their own techniques and flavors. The irony of immigrants maintaining this American tradition while being excluded from many other aspects of American life. That story rarely made it into the souvenir postcards. Women entrepreneurs found unexpected opportunities in the clambake boom. While excluded from many businesses, preparing food was considered acceptable female work. several women built Clambake empires. Mrs. Adeline Smith of Prudence Island ran operations that allegedly served President Chester Arthur in 1882. She employed 50 people during peak season and became one of Rhode Island's wealthiest self-made women. The scientific approach to clam baking emerged in this period. The Rhode Island Board of Health began regulating commercial operations in 1883 after several food poisoning incidents. Temperature requirements, timing protocols, sanitation standards. The ancient art was becoming industrialized science. Some establishments hired chemists to perfect their techniques. Imagine explaining to your ancestors that you need a chemistry degree to properly steam clams. Tourism guides from the 1880s reveal how central clam bakes had become to New England's identity. Baedeker's guide called them essential to understanding American character. Every major hotel advertised proximity to Clambake venues. Foreign dignitaries were routinely taken to Clambakes as diplomatic events. The Japanese delegation of 1860 attended one, though their written accounts suggest more politeness than enthusiasm. The temperance movement's victories created new challenges. As counties went dry, Clambake venues had to adapt. Some became explicitly family-friendly, adding carousels and games. Others found creative ways around restrictions. Boats anchored just outside territorial waters, serving alcohol with their clams. The term floating clambake originally referred to these prohibition-dodging vessels. Environmental consequences were becoming visible by the 1880s. Centuries-old clam beds were depleted near major venues. Seaweed harvesting destroyed ecosystems. Some beaches were stripped of suitable stones. The Rhode Island Fish Commission's 1889 report warned about the exhaustion of nature's bounty through commercial excess, though their warnings were largely ignored in the rush for profits. The social reforms of the Progressive Era began affecting clambake operations. Labor organizers targeted the poor working conditions in many venues. The Great Clambake Strike of 1887 at Rocky Point shut down operations for 2 weeks during peak season. Workers demanded better pay, shorter hours, and the right to eat the same food they prepared for guests. That last demand particularly outraged owners. Photography changed how clambakes were marketed and remembered. Stereoscopic cards from the 1870s and 1880s show impossibly clean beaches, well-dressed diners, and romantic sunset scenes. What they don't show are the sweating workers, the flies, the occasional food poisoning, or the growing piles of shells and waste. The image was becoming more important than the experience. The question of authenticity plagued the industry. What made a real clambake? Was it the cooking method, the ingredients, the location, the social context? Commercial operators claimed they were preserving tradition while fundamentally transforming it. Critics argued the soul of the practice was lost when it became a business. The debate sounds remarkably similar to modern arguments about cultural appropriation, perhaps because it's essentially the same issue. By 1890, the clambake industry was generating millions in revenue. What had been a gift economy practice of indigenous peoples, adapted by colonists for survival, politicized by revolutionaries, had become big business. The transformation was complete, or so it seemed. Sometimes I wonder what those ancient coastal peoples would think, seeing their sacred cooking method turned into a tourism industry. Probably the same way Italian grandmothers feel about Olive Garden. But one small Quaker community in Massachusetts was about to show that the commercial spectacular wasn't the only way forward. Allen's Neck would offer a different vision of what the Clambake could be. Allen's Neck Friends Meeting House sits quietly in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, a simple white building that wouldn't draw your attention if you didn't know its history. But in 1888, this Quaker community started something that would become the longest continuously running annual Clambake in America, a tradition that offers a completely different vision from the commercial spectacles erupting across New England. The Quakers who gathered here had their own relationship with communal meals. Their faith emphasized simplicity, equality, and community service. The decision to hold a Clambake wasn't about profit or entertainment. It was about raising funds for their Sunday school while bringing the community together. The initial organizers, led by Philip Tripp and Jonathan Bodfish, explicitly rejected the commercialized model developing elsewhere. That first Allen's Neck Clambake in August 1888 served about 100 people. Compare that to the thousands being served at Rocky Point, and you understand the deliberate choice being made here. They dug their pits by hand, gathered local seaweed, used stones from nearby fields. The menu was simple: clams, fish, corn, potatoes. No orchestras, no dancing pavilions, no railroad specials. Just neighbors feeding neighbors. The timing of Allen's Neck's establishment is significant. This was during the peak of the Gilded Age, when excess was celebrated and bigger always meant better. Yet here was a community choosing the opposite path. It's like starting a farmer's market in the age of Walmart, deliberately swimming against the current. Their records from 1889 state they wanted to preserve the simplicity of the traditional feast. You have to understand Quaker culture to grasp why this mattered. Friends, as they called themselves, believed in testimony through action. Their Clambake wasn't just about food. It was a statement about values. Everyone worked, everyone ate the same meal, everyone sat together. No class distinctions, no servants, no separate sections for different tickets. The preparation methods at Allen's Neck remained stubbornly traditional. While commercial venues were adopting steam boxes and metal equipment, the Friends continued using the original pit method. They even consulted elderly Wampanoag residents about proper techniques, one of the few documented instances of colonist descendants actively seeking indigenous knowledge about clam baking in this period. It was as if they were trying to reconnect with what those early colonists from our third chapter had observed, but never truly understood. The spiritual dimension of communal cooking that Edward Winslow and William Bradford had described but couldn't fully grasp. The annual rhythm developed its own sacred quality. Committees formed in spring to plan the August event. Families had designated roles passed down through generations. The Giffords always managed the fires. The Tripps handled seaweed gathering. The Howlands supervised the layering. This wasn't hired labor. This was community ritual. Remember those ancient communities from our beginning, passing knowledge through generations? Here it was happening again, deliberately maintained despite the modern world's interruptions. What's remarkable is how Allen's Neck resisted change while everything around them was transforming. The 1890s brought automobiles, electricity, and telephone lines to the area. Commercial clambakes added electric lights and phonographs. Allen's Neck continued to cook by daylight, eat at long wooden tables, and clean up as a community. Their 1895 meeting minutes record a debate about whether to allow photographs. They decided against it, fearing it would change the event's character. The financial model was radically different too. Tickets were priced just high enough to cover costs and raise modest funds for the Sunday school. When they had surplus, they lowered prices the next year. One visitor from Boston in 1891 wrote that he couldn't understand the absence of profit motive in such a well-attended event. The friends couldn't understand why profit would be the motive. Children played a central role at Allen's Neck in ways that commercial venues couldn't match. They helped with age-appropriate tasks, learned the techniques from elders, and most importantly, saw the entire process from preparation through cleanup. This wasn't entertainment consumed, it was tradition transmitted. Imagine actually teaching kids that food involves work and waiting, not just ordering and eating. Revolutionary concept, right? The Spanish-American War period, 1898, tested their pacifist principles. While other clambakes became patriotic rallies supporting the war, Allen's Neck maintained its quiet focus on community and faith. They refused to add military themes or decorations, causing some criticism from the broader community. Their response was typically Quaker. They simply continued doing what they'd always done. The turn of the century brought pressure to modernize. Railroad companies offered to build spurs to bring visitors. Entrepreneurs proposed partnerships to expand capacity. Local newspapers suggested they were missing economic opportunities. The Friends meeting's response was unanimous. They were not missing anything they wanted to catch. The guest books from this period reveal who was paying attention. Scholars from Harvard studying authentic folk traditions, artists seeking unspoiled Americana, and, surprisingly, representatives from commercial venues trying to understand what they'd lost. A 1902 entry from a Rocky Point manager admits there is something here that cannot be replicated through commerce. The role of women at Allen's Neck contrasted sharply with commercial venues. While elsewhere women were either excluded or relegated to service roles, Quaker women were full participants in planning and execution. Sarah Gifford ran the Clambake Committee for 15 years starting in 1894. Try finding a woman running a commercial clambake operation in that era. The preservation of technique became almost obsessive. They documented everything, the exact depth of pits, the type of wood, the timing of each stage. Not for commercial consistency, but for cultural preservation. Their records from 1900 include hand-drawn diagrams and detailed notes that archaeologists today consider invaluable for understanding traditional methods. Weather never stopped them. The 1896 Clambake proceeded despite a nor'easter. The 1899 event continued through a heat wave that sent dozens to the first aid tent. This wasn't entertainment that could be rescheduled. It was an annual covenant with their community. The scholarly interpretation suggests this reflects Quaker concepts of testimony through perseverance. The intergenerational transmission was deliberate and structured. Teenagers were assigned to shadow experienced adults, learning not just techniques, but the values embedded in the practice. The 1903 records mention young Frederick Allen learning from his grandfather. Frederick would still be helping with the Clambake in the 1960s, a living link across 7 decades. The question of who could attend was handled with typical Quaker diplomacy. While the event was open to all, it was understood this wasn't a tourist attraction. Visitors were welcome if they came to participate in the community, not to be entertained. Several accounts describe wealthy summer residents being handed rakes and asked to help with seaweed. Most never returned, which was probably the point. Environmental stewardship was built into their practice. They rotated gathering sites to prevent depletion, limited servings to what local beds could sustain, and kept detailed records of shellfish populations. When commercial operations were stripping beaches bare, Allen's Neck was practicing what we'd now call sustainable harvesting, though they'd probably just call it common sense and good stewardship. By 1905, Allen's Neck had established the template that would carry them through the next century. Simple, sustainable, community-centered. They'd proven that the Clambake didn't need to become a commercial spectacle to survive. It could remain what it had always been at its core, a community gathering around food, prepared with patience and shared with equality. But even as Allen's Neck preserved one vision of the tradition, the 20th century was about to transform the Clambake in ways no one could have imagined. The 20th century arrived with promises of progress and efficiency, and the Clambake, that ancient tradition, found itself caught between preservation and innovation. You're watching now as 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and waves of technological change transform not just how clams were cooked, but what the tradition meant to a rapidly modernizing America. World War I brought unexpected changes to clam baking. Military training camps across New England adopted the practice as an efficient way to feed large numbers of troops. Camp Devens in Massachusetts held weekly clam bakes for thousands of soldiers in 1917 and 1918. The military's systematic approach, standardized portions, precise timing, assembly line serving, stripped away the leisurely social aspects, but proved the method's practical efficiency. The irony of using an indigenous peace tradition to feed soldiers heading to war. Sometimes history has a dark sense of humor. The 1920s roared in with prosperity and prohibition. clambakes became elaborate affairs at country clubs and private estates, often serving as covers for illegal drinking. The term clam juice became code for bootleg rum in certain circles. Gatsby-esque parties on Long Island featured clambakes with champagne and jazz bands, a far cry from the Quaker simplicity of Allen's Neck or even the democratic ideals of earlier patriots. You see technology creeping into every aspect. Gas-fired steam boxes replaced wood fires at many venues. Refrigerated trucks meant clams could be shipped inland. Canned clams allowed clambakes in Kansas. The Boston Evening Transcript in 1925 lamented that the clambake has been mechanized like everything else in modern America. Yet people still crave the experience, or at least their idea of it. The Great Depression changed everything again. Suddenly, the clambake's origins as economical community feeding became relevant in new ways. Churches and civic organizations held poverty clambakes where everyone contributed what they could. Some brought clams, others potatoes, someone might manage butter. The WPA Federal Writers Project documented these Depression-era clambakes, noting how they recalled earlier times when communities naturally shared resources. Roosevelt's New Deal programs actually funded clambake infrastructure. The Civilian Conservation Corps built permanent clambake facilities at state parks throughout New England. You can still see their stonework at places like Goddard Memorial State Park in Rhode Island, massive fire pits designed to serve hundreds, built by young men who'd never seen the ocean before arriving at camp. The ethnic evolution of the tradition accelerated during this period. Italian immigrants added sausages and peppers. Portuguese families contributed lingua and their own shellfish preparations. Jewish communities created kosher clambakes using fish instead of shellfish. Each group claimed to be improving the tradition while purists mourned the loss of authenticity. The debate sounds familiar because it's essentially the same argument that's been happening since colonists first modified indigenous methods. World War II transformed clambakes into morale-building events. Defense plants held them for workers building ships and planes. The USO organized clambakes for servicemen shipping out from Boston and Newport. Women's groups prepared thousands of victory clambakes using ration butter and whatever seafood wasn't requisitioned for the troops. The propaganda value was explicit. New England tradition fueling the fight for freedom. The post-war suburban boom brought new interpretations. The backyard clambake became a middle-class aspiration. Sears sold clambake kits through their catalog, metal pots, special forks, checkered tablecloths, even frozen clam packages. Television shows demonstrated easy clambake techniques that bore little resemblance to traditional methods. Julia Child's 1960s version using a wash boiler on a home stove would have horrified earlier generations, though she at least acknowledged she was adapting rather freely. The interstate highway system, completed through New England in the 1960s, changed the geography of clambaking. Previously isolated coastal communities became day trip destinations. Massive clambake restaurants sprouted along Route 1. The authentic New England clambake became a tourist commodity, complete with lobster bibs and plastic souvenirs. Places advertised just like the pilgrims ate, which historians note is wrong on multiple levels. Environmental awareness in the 1970s brought uncomfortable reckonings. Marine biologists documented the depletion of clam beds from overharvesting. The Clean Water Act revealed that many traditional clambake beaches were too polluted for safe shellfish gathering. Some communities had been cooking contaminated clams for years without knowing it. The romantic image of gathering your own clams became a health hazard requiring licenses and water quality testing. The microwave arrived in American kitchens, promising to revolutionize everything, including clam bakes. Food companies marketed microwave clam bake dinners, frozen meals that could be steamed in minutes. A 1978 advertisement claimed all the tradition, none of the weight. Because nothing says ancient tradition like radioactive waves heating a plastic tray. But hey, at least they tried to keep the concept alive. Corporate team building discovered clam bakes in the 1980s. Management consultants sold them as authentic experiences promoting cooperation. IBM, digital equipment, and other tech companies held elaborate clam bakes where executives pretended to dig pits while caterers did the actual work. I love the image of software engineers in khakis trying to decode the metaphor of steaming clams as synergy. Probably took PowerPoints to explain it. The metaphor of layering ingredients and patient waiting was stretched to cover everything from product development to merger strategies. The rise of food television in the 1990s brought new attention and new distortions. Celebrity chefs created deconstructed clam bakes and clam bake-inspired fusion cuisine. The Food Network featured clam bake competitions where speed mattered more than tradition. Reality shows staged dramatic clam bake disasters for entertainment. The actual practice of patient, communal cooking became background scenery for manufactured drama. Native American communities began reclaiming their narrative during this period. The Mashpee Wampanoag and other tribes started holding public educational clam bakes, teaching the original methods and spiritual significance. These events challenged the colonial narrative that had dominated for centuries. Some non-native organizers began acknowledging indigenous origins, though often in ways that felt more like footnotes than genuine recognition. The local food movement of the early 2000s created interesting tensions. Locavores celebrated clam bakes as original farm-to-table dining, while struggling with the reality that most clams were now farmed or imported. Climate change meant traditional species were migrating north. What did authentic mean when the local ecosystem had fundamentally changed? Academic conferences debated these questions while ordinary people just wanted their summer tradition. The tech era brought digital innovations, apps for timing your clam bake, YouTube tutorials on pit digging, Instagram-worthy clam bake presentations, virtual clam bakes during COVID where people cooked along via Zoom. The collision of ancient technique with modern technology created sometimes absurd juxtapositions, live streaming something that traditionally took all day, hashtagging experiences that predated written language. By the early 2000s, the Clambake had survived industrialization, commercialization, mechanization, and digitization. It had been transformed, appropriated, reimagined, and packaged in every conceivable way. Yet somehow, in places like Allen's Neck, in backyards and on beaches, people were still digging pits, heating rocks, and waiting patiently for steam to work its magic. The question now was whether this resilient tradition could navigate the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, cultural reckonings, and a generation that had never known a world without instant everything. The great Clambake diaspora of the mid-20th century saw New Englanders carrying their beloved tradition to the most unlikely places. You're about to witness how a cooking method born on Atlantic beaches attempted to survive in landlocked states, adapted to different ingredients, and sparked debates about authenticity that continue to this day. The post-war economic boom sent New Englanders across America for jobs, engineers to California's aerospace industry, insurance executives to Chicago, retirees to Florida. They carried Clambake nostalgia with them like ancestral photographs. By the 1950s, New England societies in places like Los Angeles and Phoenix were attempting clambakes in swimming pools and parking lots. Watching someone try to recreate a beach tradition in the Mojave Desert, it's like seeing your grandmother's recipe made with substitute ingredients, technically correct but emotionally wrong. The logistics of inland clam baking required creative solutions. Seaweed was shipped dried or frozen from the coasts, losing most of its steam-producing properties. Midwestern clam bakes substituted corn husks or wet newspapers. The Cleveland version, developed by displaced Rhode Islanders working in steel mills, used beer-soaked burlap bags. Each adaptation claimed practicality while mourning authenticity. You see the emergence of the traveling clambake master, entrepreneurs who loaded trucks with equipment and ingredients, driving hundreds of miles to serve authentic New England clambakes at county fairs in Iowa or corporate events in Dallas. The most successful was probably Captain Bob's Traveling Clambake, which operated from 1955 to 1982, bringing Massachusetts clams to 37 states. Bob Marchand's diary records serving clambakes at a Wyoming rodeo, a New Mexico Pueblo celebration, and, oddly, a Hollywood movie premiere. The frozen food revolution promised to solve the distance problem. By 1960, you could buy complete clambake dinners in supermarkets from Detroit to Denver. The instructions optimistically claimed you could achieve that authentic shore flavor by adding liquid smoke to your oven. Sales figures suggest millions tried. Satisfaction surveys suggest few tried twice. Military bases became unexpected centers of clambake diffusion. New England servicemen stationed everywhere from Germany to Guam organized clambakes using whatever they could source locally. The famous Operation Clambake at Fort Hood, Texas in 1964 involved airlifting fresh shellfish from Boston and teaching 500 Texan soldiers the proper layering technique. The base newspaper called it cultural exchange at its most delicious. Regional variations evolved based on local ingredients. Colorado's mountain clam bakes added trout and elk sausage. New Mexico versions incorporated green chiles and used lava rocks that held heat differently than granite. Minnesota's Scandinavian immigrants created a hybrid with lefse and lutefisk that purists considered blasphemous, but locals loved. Each variation sparked letters to New England newspapers defending or denouncing the changes. The automobile culture of the 1960s created the portable clambake. Elaborate trailer-mounted steamers that could be towed to any location. The Winnebago Company even produced a limited Clambake edition RV with built-in steam compartments and clam refrigeration. Only 43 were sold. Apparently, the overlap between RV enthusiasts and Clambake traditionalists was smaller than marketing had hoped. California's interpretation deserves special attention. By the 1970s, West Coast clambakes had evolved into something unrecognizable to New Englanders. Dungeness crab replaced lobster, sourdough substituted for brown bread, and worst of all, from a traditionalist perspective, wine was served instead of beer. The Los Angeles Times food critic in 1973 called it translation rather than transplantation. New England newspapers called it culinary treason. The commercial clambake companies that emerged to serve displaced New Englanders became cultural ambassadors or cultural distorters, depending on your perspective. Lobsters to Go would ship complete clambake ingredients anywhere in the continental U.S., with instructions that grew increasingly desperate as they tried to explain steam cooking to people who'd never seen the ocean. Their 1975 instruction manual included a glossary defining seaweed, quahog, and, remarkably, ocean. Academic folklorists began studying these transplanted clambakes in the 1980s. They documented fascinating adaptations. A Lithuanian community in Chicago incorporated their own smoked fish traditions. Mexican-American families in Texas added tamales to the layers. Each group insisted they were honoring the tradition while fundamentally transforming it. The scholarly debate about whether these counted as real clambakes filled several journal issues, because apparently academics need to argue about the authenticity of steamed seafood too. The rise of chain restaurants attempting clambakes was particularly controversial. Red Lobster's New England Clambake Feast launched in 1985 to howls of protest from Maine to Rhode Island. The meal involved no actual steaming, no communal preparation, and according to furious letters to the editor, no soul. Yet it introduced millions to at least the concept of a clambake, even if the execution was, as one critic wrote, like learning about love from a greeting card. Environmental and economic factors complicated inland clambakes further. Airshipping live seafood was expensive and ecologically questionable. Many inland cities couldn't source quality shellfish at any price. The solution for some was to abandon shellfish entirely, leading to clambakes featuring chicken, corn, and potatoes. Calling this a clambake was, according to the Providence Journal, like calling a bicycle a car because they both have wheels. The nostalgic pull remained powerful, though. Second and third generation descendants of New England emigrants would make pilgrimages back for real clambakes, treating them like religious experiences. It reminds me of how people travel thousands of miles to see where their grandparents were born, except these folks were making pilgrimages to eat steamed shellfish. Tourism boards capitalized on this, marketing clambake homecomings to the New England diaspora. Hotels offered packages including clambake lessons, where visitors could learn the authentic method to take back to Arizona or Arkansas. The internet age brought new possibilities and problems. Online forums erupted with arguments about proper techniques. YouTube videos of Texas clambakes using barbecue pits drew thousands of angry comments from New Englanders. Meanwhile, overnight shipping finally made fresh seafood available anywhere for those willing to pay $200 in shipping for $50 worth of clams. Cultural preservation societies began documenting regional variations, not to mock them, but to understand how traditions adapt when transplanted. The Smithsonian's Folklife Festival featured clambakes across America in 1998, showcasing 17 different regional interpretations. The exhibition's conclusion was diplomatically vague about which versions were authentic. Indigenous voices entered the debate with pointed observations. Mashpee Wampanoag elder Vernon Lopez noted in 1999 that arguing about whether Iowa corn belonged in a clambake while ignoring that the entire tradition was appropriated from native peoples was missing the forest for the trees, or the ocean for the clams. By the early 2000s, the clambake diaspora had created a fascinating pattern. The further from New England, the more elaborate the attempts to prove authenticity. Phoenix clambakes involved more ritual and rules than anything in Massachusetts. It was as if distance required increased orthodoxy, or perhaps increased theater. The question of what makes a clambake real had become unanswerable. Was it the location, the ingredients, the method, the community? Like those ancient peoples from our beginning who developed this technique independently in different locations, perhaps each adaptation was equally valid. Or perhaps, as traditionalists insisted, removing a clambake from New England was like taking a fish from water. You could keep it alive briefly, but something essential was lost. The tradition had spread across a continent, mutating and adapting, but back in New England, the original was facing its own existential challenges. Here you are in the present moment, watching a tradition that began millennia ago navigate the challenges of climate change, cultural reckonings, and a world that seems to spin faster every year. The New England clambake, having survived colonization, commercialization, and continental spread, now faces perhaps its greatest test, remaining relevant and sustainable in an era of environmental crisis and social consciousness. Climate change has fundamentally altered the geography of clam baking. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. Soft-shell clams are migrating northward, lobsters following cooler waters. Traditional clambake beaches experience red tide events with increasing frequency. What used to be reliable seasonal patterns, those rhythms indigenous peoples tracked for thousands of years, have become unpredictable. Marine biologists project that by mid-century, the species defining a traditional clambake may no longer exist in their historical ranges. You witness the economic pressures mounting. A traditional clambake for 50 people now costs what a wedding reception might have a generation ago. Lobster, once fed to prisoners, has become luxury subject to international trade wars. Local clam beds, depleted by centuries of harvesting, can't meet demand. Many operations import shellfish from Canada or farther, raising questions about what local tradition means when ingredients travel thousands of miles. The COVID-19 pandemic brought unexpected reckonings. Large gatherings became dangerous, communal eating suspect. Allen's Neck canceled in 2020 for the first time since 1888, except for 2 years during the 1918 flu. Some attempted socially distanced clam bakes with individual portions, watching people try to maintain 6 feet apart while passing hot stones really captured the absurdity of our times. Indigenous communities are asserting their rights more forcefully. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe now requires acknowledgement at public clam bakes on traditional lands. Some organizations pay honor taxes to local tribes, voluntary contributions recognizing appropriation. The Aquinnah Wampanoag run educational programs teaching the original Wampanoag, forcing non-native practitioners to confront uncomfortable truths about cultural theft. Environmental regulations have transformed the practice. Beach fires are banned in many locations due to air quality. Seaweed harvesting requires permits and quotas. Removing rocks from beaches is illegal in several states. Some venues use propane-fired steam boxes meeting emission standards, but, according to traditionalists, taste like compromise. The rise of dietary restrictions complicates communal dining. Vegans at clam bakes, shellfish allergies, religious dietary laws. The simple meal has become complex negotiation. Some venues offer plant-based clam bakes featuring mushrooms and seaweed. I suppose calling it a steam bake would be more accurate, but accuracy has never been this tradition's strong suit. Young people approach the tradition differently. Gen Z documents for Instagram rather than experiencing directly. Yet surprisingly, some embrace the slowness as rebellion against digital acceleration. Cottagecore aesthetics making traditional methods ironically trendy. The sustainability movement creates new frameworks for understanding old practices. The traditional clam bake, with local ingredients and communal preparation, suddenly appears progressive rather than primitive. The carbon footprint of pit cooking is remarkably small, unless you count the SUVs everyone drives to get there. Scientific research validates traditional methods. Seaweed contains compounds reducing harmful bacteria. Stone steaming preserves more nutrients than modern cooking. Communal eating may boost immunity through controlled microbial exchange. Ancient wisdom validated by modern science, though indigenous peoples needed no peer-reviewed studies. Cultural tourism keeps many traditions economically viable. International visitors seek authentic experiences, paying premiums for what locals take for granted. Some communities depend on this, others resist, trying to preserve traditions from becoming performative commodities. Technology continues reshaping practice. Apps locate clambakes, social media groups argue techniques, smart thermometers monitor pit temperatures. The ancient art of reading steam patterns replaced by digital sensors, though stones still take exactly as long to heat. Legal battles emerge over tradition ownership. Who can call something a traditional New England clambake? Can it be trademarked? Several lawsuits failed when judges realized you can't copyright something indigenous peoples developed millennia ago. The academic world continues analyzing. Anthropologists study invented traditions, food historians trace evolution, sociologists examine class dynamics. Each discipline claiming to understand the true meaning, while perhaps missing that people simply enjoy eating together. Modern clambake masters navigate between tradition and innovation. They use GPS for clamming beds, but read tides by instinct. Transport in refrigerated trucks, but cook using ancient methods. Post on social media while banning phones from beaches. Some communities return to older practices from necessity. As commercial operations become unsustainable, smaller community-centered clambakes resurge. Neighborhood groups organizing like Depression-era communal feeds, everyone contributing what they can. The question of authenticity remains unresolved. Is it still traditional if clams are farmed? If participants are transplants? If indigenous peoples are excluded? Each generation redefines authenticity to match circumstances, just as colonists redefined indigenous practices, just as every immigrant group added variations. Yet somehow the essence persists. People gather. Stones heat. Steam rises. Food cooks slowly while communities connect. The waiting remains irreducible. You cannot rush steam, cannot optimize ancient physics. In a world of increasing speed and isolation, the clambake offers something rare. Mandatory slowness and communal presence. Sometimes I wonder if the real tradition isn't specific ingredients or methods, but simply stopping long enough to share a meal that takes all day. Maybe that's what those ancient coastal peoples knew, that waiting was the point, gathering was the purpose, food was just the excuse. Looking forward, the clambake faces uncertainty. Climate change may relocate it to Canada. Economic pressures may price it out. Cultural evolution may transform it beyond recognition. Or perhaps, as for thousands of years, this simple method will adapt and persist, teaching each generation that some things cannot be rushed, Some experiences cannot be digitized. Some traditions survive because they feed something deeper than hunger. The stones still heat, steam still rises, and somewhere people still gather, waiting and sharing this ancient feast, modified, reimagined, appropriated, argued over, but somehow miraculously enduring. And so, here we are at the end of our journey through smoke and steam and centuries. The story of the Clambake, like the tradition itself, has taken its time unfolding, layer by layer, revelation by revelation. You've traveled from those ancient beaches where nameless peoples first discovered that hot stones and seaweed could transform the sea's bounty, through complex exchanges between indigenous communities and colonists, watching sacred traditions become survival techniques, then social customs, then commercial enterprises. Each transformation adding layers of meaning, or perhaps obscuring original purposes. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might imagine those patient preparations. The gathering of stones, smooth and heavy in ancient hands. The careful selection of seaweed, still dripping with ocean brine. The precise layering of food, each placement deliberate and practiced. The long waiting while steam works its slow magic. Picture the countless gatherings this tradition has witnessed. Indigenous ceremonies under star-filled skies. Colonial families learning new ways to survive. Revolutionary patriots declaring independence with clams and conviction. Immigrant communities adding their own flavors. Families reuniting summer after summer, generation after generation, around the same smoking pits. Feel the heat from those stones, accumulated slowly, released gradually. The way tradition itself accumulates and releases meaning. The way communities gather and disperse, always returning, always drawn back to the circle of warmth. Listen to the sounds. The hiss of steam, ancient as the first time water met hot stone. The pop of opening shells, like small applause for patience rewarded. The murmur of conversation, stories told while waiting. The same sounds echoing across centuries, unchanged despite everything that's changed. Your breathing is slowing now, matching the patient rhythm of traditional preparation. No rushing, no optimization, just the natural pace of transformation. Like those stones cooling gradually, your day's tensions are releasing, dissipating like steam into evening air. Perhaps tomorrow you'll wake thinking about patience, about how some things resist our modern urgency, how stones still take the same time to heat, how steam still rises at its own pace, how communities still need time to truly gather. The deep knowledge that some experiences can't be rushed, some connections can't be digitized. Let your thoughts drift now, like smoke from dying embers, like steam condensing back to water, like tides retreating to return another day. The stories we've shared settling into memory, becoming part of your own internal landscape. Your eyelids are heavy as heated stones, your breathing deep as ocean tides, your mind quiet as a beach before dawn. The day's sharp edges softening, blurring, dissolving into the gentle fog of approaching sleep. Rest now, knowing that traditions endure, that communities persist, that some things remain constant despite all change. The stones will still be there tomorrow. The tides will still turn. The steam will still rise. Close your eyes. Let go of the day's grip. Float on the warm currents of drowsiness. You're safe. You're comfortable. You're exactly where you need to be. Sleep is arriving now, as inevitable as steam from hot stones, as welcome as food after patient waiting, as natural as tides following their ancient patterns. Let it take you, carry you, into peaceful depths. Everything is settling, cooling, quieting. Only peace remains, deep and encompassing, drawing you down, down into restful darkness. Sweet dreams.